Hi everyone, welcome to another lecture. I hope you're all doing well and looking forward to starting this next module. Today we're going to focus in on the concept of perception, and specifically we're going to be looking at attribution theory. So perception is a really important piece of interpersonal communication, right? And certainly Carnegie spends a lot of time talking about how our perceptions influence how we communicate and how much better off we would really be if we took some time to kind of question our perceptions and more specifically look at things from the perspective of others. So we're going to talk a lot today about the role of perception in interpersonal communication. And then specifically, we're going to follow the pattern that we've been following so far, and we're going to pick a certain theory and apply that to communication. Today's theory is called attribution theory. So we'll look at its major principles and we'll try to kind of reflect upon how we can use the theory to not only better understand the reading, but also think about how perceptions may influence our own behaviors. Okay. So in order to do that, I thought a good place to start might actually be putting you through some perception exercises and giving you the chance to work on a couple of these exercises online. I've never really done this virtually before, so I'm hopeful that it still works. I think it will, but we'll play it by ear, right? We'll see how it goes. So let me start by showing you this image and asking you to engage in the directions that you're given, right? It says count the F's in the sentence below. Okay, I'll give you a second to do that, and I'd like to ask you how many you've got, but you can record that on your own. Right? Let me tell you, there are 6 F's in that sentence. Right? The odds that you actually saw 6 F's are very, very small. If you did, good for you. If you didn't, go back and take another look. Data suggests that we simply cannot process F's in that way when they come at the end of a word. So if you did not find 6, let me give you a minute here to go back and look. And you can easily see these F's, but keep looking. And I wonder if you actually saw this F. Probably caught that. But then as you kept looking, did you see this F as well? Okay, my guess is most of you didn't. I know the first time that I went through this, I was able to catch one, but I didn't catch the other. I found 5 F's. Okay, let me give you another perception exercise here, and let's switch to this screen. Wait, how about this one? Why don't you read that out loud? Again, it's a little weird to do it virtually, but hopefully you took time to do that. You actually read that out loud. I've used this in class before, and I tell you, every single time I have a student read it out loud, this is what I hear. A bird in the bush. But let's take a closer look, right? That's not what that said, is it? If you look really closely, it says a bird in the bush. All right, here's why I've asked you to engage at least these initial exercises, right? What we know is that human beings tend to be cognitive misers. I think that's an important term to think about as we start our conversation regarding perception. Cognitive miser, what's that mean? Well, cognitive means like thinking, right, or processing. Miser refers to being stingy or really hanging on tight, not wanting to expend much. Scrooge is a really famous example of a miser. So you put those terms together, cognitive miser, and you have someone who is stingy, who doesn't really want to take time to think or process much. I'm not trying to personally insult anyone, but the truth is human beings tend to be kind of stingy when it comes to having to think, or at least having to think critically and process things deeply. So when we look at images like we just saw, our instinct is to just process it very quickly. And when we do that, we sometimes make mistakes or we miss things, right? We miss some of the F's in the previous sentence, or we make the mistake and we just assume the sentence is grammatically correct and what it should be, and don't actually realize what's in front of us, right? And in this case, it's the extra word. So that's a really good place to start, at least when we talk about perceptions. Let's keep in mind this idea of the fact that in general, when it comes to our perceptions, human beings are cognitive misers. We're kind of lazy. We tend to take the shortcuts. But there's another thing that I want you to be thinking about, and let me flip the slide here and show you this picture. And I'm wondering, when you look at this picture, what you see, right? Some of you may look at this picture and automatically see this old woman, right? On the other hand, some of you might look at the picture and see a young, kind of young woman or young dancer, right? Depending on your perception, you might see both of those images, right? If you're struggling to see them, again, you can pause it here and try and kind of work through seeing both those. The young woman, it helps me to think of this, or to look at this and see that as her chin, as if she was like looking back over her shoulder. There's her nose and her eyelash. The other thing that really helps me to see the young woman is to see this as her neck, and specifically see this as like a choker or necklace around her neck. On the other hand, if you're having any trouble seeing the older woman, again, my strategy is to go right here and look at this, but this time realize that that's her mouth. Those are kind of like her lips leading down into her chin. And then in this case, for the old woman, this is like her big nose sticking out. Okay, so the reason why I think this image is important, we can find lots of examples of this, but this is important because I think what it calls to our attention is the fact that even when we're all looking at the same thing, we might see different things. We might have different perceptions, right? Some of you may have looked at this and immediately saw the old woman. Some of you may have looked at it and immediately saw the young woman. So you may have had differences there. Hopefully you've come to a point where you can see both, right? Both images. Although even in that case, we know that we can't see both images at the same time. Our brains just don't work that way. So you might be able to flip back and forth really fast and flip from being able to see the young woman and then the old woman, but your brain just can't simply see both of those things at the same time. And so I think that's also kind of important to think about as we're talking about perception, and specifically how perception influences communication. So just keep those ideas in the back of your mind. First, we tend to be cognitive misers. We tend to be kind of lazy and want to take shortcuts when it comes to the process of perception. And second, when we look at something, we all can have different perceptions, right? We can look at the same image and see something different. So with both of those things in mind, let me introduce you to the theory called attribution theory that was developed by Carl Wiener. Essentially, his theory says that when we look at a situation, what we tend to do is we tend to process it by ascribing motives to the behaviors of the people involved, both our own behaviors and the people that we're interacting with. Right? Ultimately, we're trying to come up with explanations for why people act the way they act. And this theory argues that there are some real patterns that we tend to follow, and then those patterns, or those that lead to the explanations, then in turn go on to influence how we communicate, right, and how we interact with others. So let's unpack that a little more and do so by looking at these examples. All right, so I'm going to present to you a couple of scenarios. I'm just going to ask you to read the scenario here, and when you're reading the scenario, I want you to kind of take a look at the different situations and see how things kind of go in two different directions, right? So read the scenario and kind of think about what's leading to the different attributions and what's affecting kind of the positive and negative explanations that you might be coming up with, and also think a little bit about the impact, okay, of the explanations that you come up with. Right? All of these questions, all of these things that you think about ultimately can be explained through attribution theory. But let's go ahead and start and look at these examples. Okay, here we have our first situation that could potentially lead to a conflict. It says, why haven't I received Jack's report yet? Maybe I just missed it. I think he was late submitting last week too. He's really irresponsible. I wonder if he's not getting his other work done. The report was now due more than 2 days ago, and he's so inconsiderate. I knew I couldn't count on him. Jack is a real jerk. So we read this scenario, we can see that things really kind of progress downhill in a hurry. Initially, the individual kind of takes some of the blame for why the report isn't in yet, and actually says, oops, maybe it was my mistake. But we can see it doesn't take long for this person to kind of process and think through things and all of a sudden draw the conclusion that, Jack's a jerk. Imagine this situation instead. Okay, here we have a situation where the person says, I asked Tracy to send me a check for the tickets I bought for us to go to the concert 2 weeks ago. I still haven't gotten anything in the mail. She must be really busy. I remember her telling me that her grandmother wasn't doing well. I'm sure she's just trying to help out the family and deal with her grandmother's illness. The tickets are probably the last thing on our mind. Maybe I should just go, just call to check in and see if there's anything I can do. All right, so this thought process leads us to a really different conclusion and then in turn a really different set of behaviors. Okay. These are just hypothetical examples and they're just simple examples, but hopefully they get you thinking a little bit about maybe some of your own personal experiences, right? And how quickly we go from experiencing some particular behavior, whether that's a missed report from a colleague or a missed payback from a friend, and how quickly we start to make assumptions and come up with explanations for why that behavior occurred. Right? The theory we're getting ready to talk about can offer a lot of explanations for how and why we come to the conclusions that we do. In these two situations, clearly the first situation led to a very negative explanation, right? Which you can imagine is probably not going to lead to a great outcome. And then here in this second situation, we have a much more positive explanation. And in fact, it leads the individual to thinking, oh my gosh, I should reach out, right? So again, this theory will really help us better understand what led to these different attributions and how that might go on to affect our behavior. So let's dig in. All right, so attribution theory argues that we make or we come up with explanations for behavior. We make attributions according to a couple of different continuums. The first one is the fact that we may make attributions that are either dispositional or situational. So you can see here the explanation for what a dispositional attribution is. Essentially, when you see a behavior and you try to explain it with the idea that that behavior is something within the person's control and that has something to do with their personality or their own behavior, something about their own like demographics, then we consider that internal, or another fancy word to say that is we consider that dispositional. So like, let's imagine a situation where you were supposed to have a meeting and the individual was late. If you are coming up with an explanation for why they're late, and you are making a dispositional attribution, then you're probably going to say something like, he just didn't care about this meeting. He didn't bother to show up on time. Or you might say something like, he's always irresponsible. He probably didn't even think to set his alarm and he overslept. Hopefully you can see how those are examples of internal attributions. They're coming up with causes for a certain behavior that are kind of based in that person's personality, right, or something specific to them. On the other hand, attribution theory says we sometimes make attributions that are situational. And a situational attribution comes from when we determine that the cause of an event is somehow outside of that person. So it has something to do with the situation or the environment. We call these external or situational attributions. So we can use the same behavior, in the same example that I used earlier of this person being late, but this time if we attribute the lateness to a situational attribution, we would say something like, well, this person is late because they probably got stuck in traffic. Or this person is late because, it's the middle of winter and we know that the roads were icy, and so they had to drive slower than they normally would drive. Right? So hopefully you can see the difference there. But this is definitely a major, again, continuum with which attribution theory says we ascribe causes of behavior. We tend to assume behavior either is internal, dispositional, or it's caused by external or situational characteristics. Okay, in addition to that, all right, guys, I just advanced the slide and I realized that somehow one of the slides I thought that was part of this PowerPoint lecture is missing, but we're just going to roll with it. To be honest, because I'm recording, I don't really know how to go back in and add that sucker in, but I think it's okay. We can make this work. I do want to point out that before we look at this picture, that another continuum that attribution provides for how we make causal attributions is stable or unstable. We explain the causes of a behavior as being either stable or unstable. So let me give you an example, right? Let's imagine that you're in a meeting and that you have a colleague and this colleague interrupts you, okay? And so as you're talking, they jump right in and talk over you. Now, you could make an attribution or try to come up with the cause for that behavior, and you could do so in a way that is stable, right? if you made a stable attribution, then you would be thinking something like, ugh, this person always interrupts, right? She thinks she knows more than everyone else, and she's constantly talking over people, regardless of whether it's at this meeting or a different meeting or in a different context, right? It is a stable and it's a consistent trait that she engages in. Or you could make an attribution of that interruption as being unstable, right? Unstable attributions, of course, then are the opposite, right? So you could assume, or you can explain the behavior in this case as being something that's rare or uncommon or just happened to happen in this particular instance, right? If you did that, you might be like, oh yeah, the reason she interrupted me in this case was because this issue was so important to her. Or you might be like, well, she doesn't normally interrupt, but she's under a lot of pressure right now, and there's a specific timeline that's got her panicked. So that's leading her to talk over people and try and be in a hurry. Okay. So again, that's the second continuum I want you to be aware of. We make attributions. We tend to assume the cause of the behavior is either stable or unstable. Right? If it's stable, we say things like, oh, he always does this, or she does this every time. If it's unstable, we say things like, well, it's just this particular situation, or it just happened to happen today, but it doesn't normally happen. Now, when we combine the attributional explanations that we just discussed, internal and external, with stable and unstable, we generate these 4 different conclusions. And so you can see how they kind of map together, right? When we make attributions that are both internal and stable, what we're doing is we're explaining the cause of a behavior is due to someone's ability, right? And honestly, it may come from just teaching undergraduate classes. What I typically think of when I think of attribution theory is performance on an exam, right? So I'm just going to use that as an example in this case, right? Let's imagine that you did really well on an exam and you aced it, right? If you think back about, well, why did I do so well? What caused me to get my A on my exam? If you assume the reason that you did that is internal and stable, right? In other words, I'm just really smart. Like I'm really good at this stuff, and I tend to always be good at this stuff. I always, get A's. Then you're gonna the explanation you've come up with for why you did well in this test is it's because it's your ability, right? You're a great student. You're a smart person. So that's one explanation. On the other hand, if we move down here, you can see if you explain the A on the exam due to being something internal but unstable, then the explanation is really more looking at your motivation, right? In this case, you might say, well, I did really great on the exam because I worked so hard, right? Maybe I don't always work that hard. Maybe I'm not always that smart. It doesn't always come easy to me. But in this particular instance, in this situation, right, I did the hard work. It's an internal thing. And I was highly motivated to get a good grade on the exam. So I studied and I got a good grade. If we move over here to external attributions, when you put external with stable, right? In this case, you're thinking what caused the exam. If you're coming up with what caused you to do well in the exam. If you're coming up with an external and stable explanation, then you might say, well, the exam was just really easy. The exams in this class are always really easy, right? And so no wonder I did well on the exam. The test itself wasn't that hard. Right? It didn't have anything to do with me and how smart I am or how hard I worked, but it's an external explanation, right? The exams in this class are always easy. Finally, our last potential conclusion that we can draw is that the outcome was due to luck, right? And you can see when we come to that conclusion, it's because we've made an external attribution and an unstable attribution, right? Well, I really just guessed on the exam, right? Again, it didn't really have anything to do with me and what I know about the topic or how hard I worked, but I looked at the questions and the questions that were asked and I just guessed and I happened to get them right this time. I got lucky. So, I encourage you to think a little bit more about this chart and think about some of the attributions that you might be making of both your own behavior as well as maybe some of your colleagues' behaviors. Because think of the impact of these attributions, right? If you're attributing someone's behavior due to something that just has to do with their ability, right, versus due to something like luck, that's really going to impact how you interact with that person, right? And how you kind of move forward in your relationship with that person. And it's going to influence how you respond, right? And I think this is a lot of what Carnegie has to say, right? When we give people the benefit of the doubt, right, and we try to put ourselves in other people's shoes, and then it kind of influences some of our perceptions, then again, which in turn influences how we interact with people. Here's kind of another visual just to kind of unpack what I just mentioned here, right? Attribution theory says that the way we do try to come up with causes or explanations for behaviors does in fact influence our motivations and our behaviors. Right? So you just kind of work through this flow chart here and see that an event happens, right? It's not the event that really influences our motivation or behavior. It's how we perceive the event, right? It's our perceptions and the attributions or the causes that we come up with that explain the event. That's what influences our motivation and our behavior. As we discussed, according to the theory, when some event happens, you can make internal or external attributions. You can make stable or unstable attributions. Sometimes the theory also goes into detail about whether or not you think the behavior was under that person's control or not something that they can control. But those things then go on to influence your expectations and your emotions or your affect. Right? Think about this. If you think the cause of an event is stable and that the same outcome will be expected in a similar situation in the future, that's really going to impact your motivation. That could be positive or that could be negative. Based on some of your problem list statements earlier in the semester, my guess is some of you might feel like you're in a work situation that is caused by stable and probably external factors that no matter what you do, it's not going to improve the situation or it's not going to make things better, right? You have this expectation that things are going to remain stable and that you're going to get the similar outcome no matter what. Think how demotivating that is, right? I mean, I know I've experienced that before, and I tell myself, well, there's nothing I can do. I can't make it better, right? Nothing I do will change things. And certainly sometimes that's the case, but also sometimes having that awareness and thinking through it can also help us kind of take a step back and maybe reevaluate things. Right? I mean, to be honest, the flip side can be true as well, right? Maybe you have a situation where things are going really well, right? Sometimes I use sports as an example. Maybe you are a great tennis player and you are going out there and you're winning all your tennis matches and you're winning tennis tournaments, right? And so you've come to the conclusion that you're always going to win, right? No matter what. You don't really have to work that hard, but I'm just going to win, right? Again, that's still kind of demotivating, right? You're not feeling like you have to work very hard. Just in this case, the outcome actually, at least for the time being, is a positive one. Down here, you can see that the chart is just trying to explain that our emotions are kind of a consequence of the controllability of the attribution, right? When we feel like it is something that the behavior is something that we can control, right? Then we feel like we have power over the situation, right? Versus when it's something we don't feel like we can control, we tend to find that very infuriating, right? Frustrating, right? And we respond accordingly. So this is, again, something that I hope you will kind of take some time to think about and process, both in terms of how this theory could be used to explain some of Carnegie's ideas, but also I hope you take some time to kind of think through and maybe think about how you might be able to apply these ideas to some of your own personal or work experiences, right? Again, it's really, the theory says a lot of this stuff really doesn't have to do with the event itself, but it's much more about how we process or perceive the event that influences the outcomes related to our behavior and our motivation. Okay, now one thing we know, and this kind of goes back to my idea that humans are cognitive misers, is that in general, we're not always particularly accurate with our perceptions and or our attributions. Okay? And we tend to make attributions that really fulfill this self-serving bias. In other words, the attributions make us look good, right? You can kind of see that illustrated in this Snoopy's or this Peanuts comic. Okay? If I go back to the exam example, right? Let me give you an illustration of what it would mean to give a self-serving bias, right? So we might say, okay, I'm taking this exam, my roommate is taking this exam. Let's imagine that neither one of us do very well on the test, right? In this case, odds are if I don't do very well on the test, I'm going to kind of say that the reason I didn't do well had to do with something maybe the professor did. She asked questions that were unfair or were too hard. It couldn't have been my fault, right? It was some other reason for why the exam didn't do well. That's a very self-serving bias. Again, I think this is something that I know I'm guilty of at work, and maybe some of you can experience this as well, right? When we tend to experience frustrations, problems, automatically we tend to assume attributions and explanations that serve this self-serving bias, right? That make us look better. Related to that is this concept of the fundamental attribution error, FAE. Okay. And this is a good visual of what the fundamental attribution error says. Essentially, this mistake is when we make external attributions for our flaws, but internal attributions for the flaws of others. And so in this case, sometimes I like to give a car example or a driving example, right? Imagine like you're driving to your way to work, and the person in front of you is doing a very bad job driving, and they are maybe speeding up and slowing down, or swerving, or really just doing something to kind of get on your nerves and not be a good driver. If I were to ask you, why do you think that person is not doing a good job driving? You probably would say things like, my first guess would be, well, they're on their phone. They're distracted, right? Or you might say something like, well, they're messing with the radio. Or honestly, you might say something like, well, they're kind of old, right? They're just a bad driver. Now you may notice that all of those explanations were internal or dispositional, right? And again, that's what fundamental attribution error says we tend to do. When other people make mistakes, it's their fault. It's something that they are doing. Now let's flip that. Imagine you're driving into work and you yourself are driving poorly, right? And you swerve or something like that. In this case, if I asked you, well, why'd you do that? My guess is you'd be much more likely to say something like, well, there's ice all over the road. I had to swerve to miss the ice. Or we live in Michigan, right? So there's potholes everywhere. I had to avoid a pothole. Maybe you had to avoid Chippy, right? Maybe the chipmunk ran out in the road and you didn't want to run over that little animal, right? Now see what's happening with those explanations? All of those are external, right? All of those are situational. In all of those cases, it's not your fault why you're driving poorly. It's the situation or the environment that led you to the bad driving behavior. So hopefully that's a good illustration to explain what this fundamental attribution error is. Again, we tend to make internal attributions when other people make mistakes. We tend to make external attributions when we do something wrong. So one more thing that I just encourage you to think a little bit about and see if, A, I want you to understand that, but B, to think a little bit about and see if, oh yeah, maybe, you know, I notice myself engaging in that bias. Last thing I want to share here is another bias that we engage in, and that is the idea that most of our attributions are influenced by relational factors as well. And you can kind of read through this comic as it kind of illustrates this point. But essentially what that's saying is when we are in a relationship that we view positively and that we are satisfied by, whether that's with a work colleague or a boss or a romantic partner, when things are going well, then we tend to give others the benefit of the doubt. Maybe you've heard the term rose-colored glasses before, right? So if you are happy at work, if you're happy with your romantic partner, you tend to cut them some slack. Even something as simple as maybe your romantic partner brought you flowers, right? And you're happy with them at the time, you're satisfied in your relationship, and they bring you flowers and you think, oh, that was such a nice gesture. This person always is so thoughtful. Great. On the other hand, when your relationship is not going well, if you were unsatisfied by the relationship, if you were frustrated with your boss, if you're irritated with your coworker, right? If you're not happy with your romantic partner, you're much more inclined to ascribe negative explanations or attributions for their behavior. Maybe your romantic partner, again, brings you flowers, but you've had kind of a rocky go of it for a while, and now these flowers, all of a sudden, you explain them by the fact that, oh, they're just trying to suck up. They're just trying to get off the hook. They were too lazy to like do their chores, and so they thought they could buy me off with this small gift. Again, so yeah, we're talking about the exact same behavior in this instance, but depending on the nature of the relationship, it might lead to very different explanations for what the behavior means. So that's another thing, you know, think about maybe and have a little bit of awareness of this additional attribution error or perception bias that we have, you know, whether you think about that in your personal life or your life at work. Okay. When you put all these things together, if you haven't already, I encourage you to go now and take a look at some of the exercises I have posted for this module. Specifically, I really encourage you to now take a look at the perception checking exercise. It offers a few tips that help us to kind of think through what kind of perceptions are we making, what kind of attributions are we making, kind of encourages us to, kind of calls us out if we're maybe making some of these biases that we just discussed, and gives us some strategies to avoid that and to try to enhance kind of the accuracy of our perceptions, and in turn kind of hopefully have a positive impact on our communication behaviors. So we're right at a half an hour here, so I think I will stop this lecture. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out, and I'll look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.